Right, let's get stuck in. How do we know about struggles for rights and freedoms? This is our second lesson on textbook chapter 4.2. Booyah! So our learning goals are, and make sure you write these down. 1. Know how we've learned about the struggle for Indigenous rights and freedoms in Australia. That's it. Right. So one of the ways that we know about Indigenous rights and freedoms in Australia is from political commentary. So politicians have been making policies and laws that apply to Indigenous people since Australia was colonised by Europeans in 1788. Yeah? So even just looking at what those policies and laws are gives you a lot of information about their struggle for rights. And lots of people like journalists and cartoonists have commented on these policies and laws. So here's a political cartoon which can shed some light on the struggle for Indigenous rights and freedoms. Australia was federated into a country on the 1st of January 1901. And yeah, what's this cartoon saying? Here's all your European people on the left there. Yay! They've made a constitution, they've made a new country. And who's feeling left out on the right hand side there? Here's another one. So the joke there obviously being, yep, we can have everything, but we'll call you traditional owners. Yeah. Obviously the difference between a traditional owner and an actual owner is that an actual owner could buy, sell and make money off land, whereas a traditional owner is just allowed to hunt and fish in it, or whatever those Indigenous people used to do before colonisation. So there's some official documentation that we can look at to learn about Indigenous rights and freedoms in Australia as well. So in 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II, it was the United Nations, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed by lots and lots of countries, including us, Australia. Now, obviously in that declaration, which you're going to see in a minute, there was a requirement that human rights are protected, and the UN every year reports on how well countries are sticking to that Declaration of Human Rights. And here is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on a large piece of paper being held up by a nice lady. Wish I could print that large. Anyway. Right, so there's an organisation called the Human Rights Watch, and their World Report in 2019 said the following on Indigenous rights. Indigenous Australians are significantly overrepresented in the criminal justice system, often for minor offences. They contribute to 28% of the prison population, but only 2% of the national population. So Indigenous people get put in jail way more often. Yeah. Depressing stuff. It also said that the Australian Law Reform Commission recommended the government develop some targets to reduce that rate of putting Indigenous people in jail and getting rid of discriminatory laws like mandatory sentencing. Yeah. Indigenous people are more likely to go to jail for crimes than non-Indigenous people, even if they commit the same crime. That's part of the discrimination. In August, The Guardian, a left-leaning newspaper, reported that more than 407 Indigenous people had died in custody since 1991. And a Royal Commission was established to look into the issue. So, dying in jail, not cool. So, essentially, the thing to take out of that Human Rights Watch is that Australia could do a lot better when it comes to Indigenous rights. So let's check out a video explaining what universal human rights are.
The idea of human rights is that each one of us, no matter who we are or where we are born, is entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms. Human rights are not privileges, and they cannot be granted or revoked. They are inalienable and universal. That may sound straightforward enough, but it gets incredibly complicated as soon as anyone tries to put the idea into practice. What exactly are the basic human rights? Who gets to pick them? Who enforces them, and how? The history behind the concept of human rights is a long one. Throughout the centuries and across societies, religions, and cultures, we have struggled with defining notions of rightfulness, justice, and rights. But one of the most modern affirmations of universal human rights emerged from the ruins of World War II with the creation of the United Nations. The treaty that established the UN gives as one of its purposes to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And with the same spirit, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document, written by an international committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, lays the basis for modern international human rights law. The Declaration is based on the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It lists 30 articles recognizing, among other things, the principle of non-discrimination and the right to life and liberty. It refers to negative freedoms, like the freedom from torture or slavery, as well as positive freedoms, such as the freedom of movement and residence. It encompasses basic civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression, religion, or peaceful assembly, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to education and the right to freely choose one's occupation and be paid and treated fairly. The Declaration takes no sides as to which rights are more important, insisting on their universality, indivisibility, and interdependence. And in the past decades, international human rights law has grown, deepening and expanding our understanding of what human rights are and how to better protect them. So if these principles are so well developed, then why are human rights abused and ignored time and time again all over the world? The problem, in general, is that it is not at all easy to universally enforce these rights or to punish transgressors. The UDHR itself, despite being highly authoritative and respected, is a declaration, not a hard law. So when individual countries violate it, the mechanisms to address those violations are weak. For example, the main bodies within the UN in charge of protecting human rights mostly monitor and investigate violations, but they cannot force states to, say, change a policy or compensate a victim. That's why some critics say it's naive to consider human rights a given in a world where state interests wield so much power. Critics also question the universality of human rights and emphasize that their development has been heavily guided by a small number of mostly Western nations, to the detriment of inclusiveness. The result? A general bias in favor of civil political liberties over socio-political rights, and of individual over collective or groups' rights. Others defend universal human rights laws and point at the positive role they have on setting international standards and helping activists in their campaigns. They also point out that not all international human rights instruments are powerless. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights establishes a court where the 47 member countries and their citizens can bring cases. The court issues binding decisions that each member state must comply with. Human rights law is constantly evolving, as are our views and definitions of what the basic human rights should be. For example, how basic or important is the right to democracy or to development? And as our lives are increasingly digital, should there be a right to access the internet? A right to digital privacy? What do you think?
Okay, it's everybody's favourite reflection activity. It's a pop quiz. We're just going to do 5 questions today. So, answer these questions. Pause the video if you need to. Question 1. When did Europeans begin settling Australia? I'm really hoping everyone knows the answer to that. Question 2. When was the UN Declaration of Human Rights? Hint, it was just after the end of World War II. Question 3. What is the SBS series about Indigenous history called? The one that I've been raving about, and maybe some of you watched after the last lesson. Question 4. What percentage of Australians are Indigenous? Now, don't cheat. It doesn't matter if you get these wrong. You'll learn by finding out the correct answers. And question 5, how were Indigenous people shown in film in the 1920s? Describe that if you can. Right, you should have 5 answers there. Let's look at the answers. So, when did Europeans settle Australia? 1788. When was the UN Declaration of Human Rights? That was signed in 1948. The SBS series is called First Australians. There's 3.3% of Australians are Indigenous. Now, I realise that probably didn't match up with that 2019 Human Rights Watch thing that I put up recently, but bad luck, it's gone up. Obviously, before 1788, 100% of Australians were Indigenous. Fun fact. And 5, how were Indigenous people shown in films in the 1920s? They were shown as stereotypes, as savages. Not cool. Time for some homework. So I just want you to go to this link and complete that quiz until you can get 100% on it. So just keep doing that quiz over and over again. It's only worth 10 points. Next, I want you to check out that cartoon. So go to that link, have a look at that cartoon, and then answer these questions about the cartoon. Who are the two groups being represented? Remember to include the question in your answer. So you're going to say, the two groups represented are blah, blah, blah. When do you think the cartoon is set? And why is it funny? Or is it funny? Assuming it's funny, why is it funny? And what point is the cartoonist making? What's he trying to say there? And that's the cartoon, just in case you couldn't find it. Okay, bonus homework. I want you to read chapter 4.2, which, unless you've already done it, and you can check out that video as well. It's a longer video about human rights. Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a nice one.